it's just that anyone who supported regime change in Syria, who claims to be dedicated to the liberation of Palestine, should be completely ashamed of themselves at this point, because it's so obvious that they're operationally taking the same side as the state of Israel.
Yeah, and I think there are a few things to address here. But first of all, the fact that they're still going on with these talking points is so outrageous when you consider that it's not just independent progressive media that has reported this stuff. It's not just like the reporting from journalists like Rania. This has been acknowledged in mainstream media outlets like the notorious Assadist rag, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, the Wall Street Journal has actually done really good reporting on Israel's support for the rebels in Syria. And specifically, I mean, they did a report which was published a few days after a very similar report by the Lebanese journalist Noor Samaha in Syria Deeply, which means the Wall Street Journal report could have actually been a stolen story.
Potentially.
But anyway, the Wall Street Journal interviewed a spokesperson for Fursan al-Jolan, which is the rebel group Knights of the Jolan in the Golan Heights. And the spokesperson said, quote, "Israel stood by our side in a heroic way." And then the spokesperson added, quote, "We wouldn't have survived without Israel's assistance." So you have a so-called moderate rebel admitting in the Wall Street Journal that they would not have survived without Israel's support, but we still have people in the pro-Palestine movement who support these same Syrian rebels. And not only is that intense cognitive dissonance that's ignoring basic facts, but I also think it's reflective of what we were talking about earlier, and that's how tightly controlled not just the media outlets are, but some of these groups are by Gulf regimes and Gulf money. And it's not just Gulf regimes themselves, but specifically rich donors in the Gulf. We see this with Asfari, the Syrian-British billionaire who bankrolls a lot of stuff. But then there's also a lot of rich donors behind the scenes from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, the UAE. And we see that in the past 2 years, Saudi Arabia has always been a kind of unofficial ally of Israel. It's been clear that the US, UK, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are part of this axis, and for the most part, they work together. But it just becomes so blatant, specifically under Mohammed bin Salman, the butcher of Yemen, who's loved by Thomas Friedman in the Western media in Saudi Arabia.
And The Rock. He smells what The Rock is cooking.
Yeah, I mean, when MBS was in the US, he met with not just The Rock, but also Bill Clinton, the heads of JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs, Oprah, tons of billionaires. But anyway, now Saudi Arabia and Israel are having secret meetings in Egypt. In meetings with pro-Israel groups here in the US, Mohammed bin Salman is saying the Palestinians should, quote, shut up. Saudi Arabia is buying drones from Israel. I mean, there's clearly direct coordination going on. And they've all moved into this very clear alliance against Iran and Iran's allies, including Syria. So there might have been an excuse several years ago when you could say, well, it's not entirely clear what side Israel is taking. But for the past, since at least 2015, if not earlier, it's been incredibly clear that Israel has been a key supporter of the opposition in Syria. And you cannot claim to be a pro-Palestine activist and support the Syrian rebels that are backed by Israel.
And how is it going to work out that more Western interference and involvement in the Middle East is going to be productive for Palestine? Because that's the logical conclusion that you have to come to if you support intervention in Syria. I mean, how is it a bad thing that the U.S. is being pushed out along with these Gulf governments that have been basically created in part to sell out and destroy Arab nationalism and the Palestinian cause in specific? How is that bad? And why do we constantly have to see these attacks on the Western left from people who claim to support Palestine? Like, what do you think the Western left is? Like, it's really the only element of people who are not born into supporting Palestine that do. Basically, you just want to systematically urinate on the people who've gone against their whole community and gone against their families and gone against everything, their society, to support Palestinian rights. And that's what we've just seen again and again from this rancid conservative or liberal crowd. I don't know. There's so many different elements, Jayshal grad school in SOAS and NYU. You have the woke Islamists who are against Salafi phobia. Whatever they are, they're just constantly pissing on the Western left. And that to me is just, it's so offensive. And the attacks on anti-imperialists, really gives away their whole game, because it means that they're really in the Western camp. And I'm sorry, Palestine is not going to be liberated as long as the U.S. is in the Middle East. As the goal should be to remove the U.S. and its allies from the Middle East. That's really what the goal is. It's not going to, you're not going to see a change in Palestine otherwise. And we're actually slowly starting to see that change take place. And they're upset about it.
On that note, it might be a good moment just to bring up that a lot of these same people constantly make, and from every crowd you just mentioned, constantly make this comparison between Palestine and Syria, that basically the opposition in Syria is just like Hamas or anybody fighting Israel and Palestine, and the Syrian army is basically the equivalent of the Israeli army. And I think that this has been a really destructive narrative that's been promoted on the left inside the Palestine solidarity community, and has actually led a lot of people to side with the regime changers.
As I mentioned, it initially captivated my active imagination and had me for a little while.
Well, I just want to stress a couple reasons why that's a really inaccurate comparison. I think first and foremost, Palestine is a really black and white issue, at least compared to Syria. Palestinians were minding their own business, and Zionism was imposed on them supported by imperial powers from the West. It's a settler colonial conflict where Palestinians' land has been stolen. They're being ethnically cleansed and being pushed out of their land, being replaced by Jews. That's the situation in Israel-Palestine. It's very basic, very simple.
It's settler colonialism.
Yes. The natives, the indigenous people are that's the side you should be on, right? Whereas in Syria, this is not a situation of settler colonialism. Yes, the Syrian government has its issues, but the Syrian Arab army is not the Israeli army. They're not a settler army. They are an army made up of the indigenous population of Syria.
Most of which is Sunni, by the way, which is never acknowledged. The majority of the Syrian Arab army consists of Sunnis.
Yes, exactly, because the majority of Syria is Sunnis. And the point is that this is an indigenous army. The government is indigenous, whether you like it or not, whether they're Baathists or not. They are the indigenous people of that country, and they are dealing with a war from outsiders. And if anything, Syria, you had all these foreign fighters who flooded into Syria to join the jihadi opposition. If anything, they have more in common with the foreign fighters who joined the Israeli army from all around the world out of some religious, duty to come join the Zionist project. In the case of Syria, it was a religious duty to come, join the Mujahideen project, whatever the hell you want to call it, to impose an Islamic state. So those are just a couple of the things, but also it depends, I think, most importantly, when people try to say, but you support Hamas. Now, first of all, I don't support Hamas politically, but I do believe they have a right to defend Palestinians, right? This is not the same as the insurgents in Syria, because it matters what people are fighting for. That is one of the things that is lost on the left, because the left is always taken in or drawn in by this idea of a romanticized liberation movement. And that's how the insurgents in Syria have been sold to us in the West as some sort of liberation movement. But that's not what they're fighting for. They're not fighting for liberation. Those insurgent groups have been fighting, many of them, to impose an Islamic state, to overthrow the Syrian government and impose a Salafi jihadi Saudi-style state. That is not something that should be supported, regardless of who of where. If that was the case in Palestine, if there was a movement that was beheading people, of Palestinians that was beheading people and ethnically cleansing minorities, that would not be a movement you'd want to support just because it was Palestinian.
Yeah, and what's also interesting is differentiating among the different Palestinian resistance groups, because this is another one of those points, like Israel's support for the Syrian rebels, that is really never acknowledged, because it just blatantly exposes how politically and morally bankrupt the Syrian opposition is. Hamas, early in the war in Syria, came out in support of the Syrian opposition, which was largely dominated by, similar Muslim Brotherhood style Islamist groups. But then in the past few years, Hamas has really backtracked majorly and has, specifically since the Israeli massacre in Gaza in 2014, has really repaired its relations with Iran. And now Iran and Hamas actually are on pretty good terms.
And Hamas, by the way, Hamas condemned the recent U.S., French, British airstrikes or cruise missile strikes on Syria.
They're Assadists.
Well, and then also specifically, Hamas is not the only Palestinian resistance group. And in fact, of the various groups, it probably has the worst politics. This isn't even to mention the PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. What's so funny is you'll see some of these young student activists who support the Syrian opposition who will wear shirts of Rania Khalek. But Rania Khalek, who is, by the way, a secular Marxist-Leninist from the communist PFLP, if you read her interviews, she has said very clearly, the PFLP published a statement in April of 2017 when the U.S. bombed Syrian government targets. And the PFLP published on its website, quote, PFLP denounces U.S. imperialist aggression against Syria. And if you read interviews with PFLP figures and Rania Khalek, they say very clearly that they support the Syrian government and the Syrian army fighting these foreign-backed Islamist groups. And then if you read, Rania Khalek did an interview in which she said, this was in 2013, Rania Khalek said, quote, the latest developments in Syria clearly indicate that there is a U.S.-Turkish Saudi alliance with the goal of destroying and weakening Syria as a country because it has said no to the U.S. and has not signed agreements with the Zionist entity and hosts 500,000 Palestinian refugees. So you can't wear a Rania Khalek shirt and talk about how great the PFLP is and Palestinian resistance groups are and support the Syrian opposition in opposition to, in contradiction with, those Palestinian resistance groups. Hamas is not the only Palestinian resistance group.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, one of the kind of talking points of the Syrian opposition and its supporters is that there's been this kind of Syrian government war on the Palestinian refugee population in Syria, leaving out the real frontline role that pro-government Palestinian militias like Liwa al-Quds have played, but also the real facts on the ground in the Palestinian camp of Yarmouk, with the situation is not so clear cut. There's an offensive underway right now in Yarmouk and Rania. I think you would probably know the most about what's going on there.
Well, what I wanted to note about the PFLP is that Yarmouk, right, it's called a refugee camp, but really it's more of like a big neighborhood or like a big town that hosts Palestinian refugees who are basically Syrian, and also lots of Syrians live there. And it's portrayed as an attack on Palestinians by the government. But the way that issue with the conflict in Yarmouk started is the opposition there, which Hamas had initially joined, the Hamas branch inside Yarmouk had initially joined, attacked the PFLP GC, or the general command there, by burning down their building and shooting the people inside. So it hasn't been this clear-cut conflict between the Syrian government and Palestinians. It actually started out as somewhat of a Palestinian conflict inside Yarmouk. And Hamas actually ultimately split inside Yarmouk. Initially, they fought with the opposition, but then the opposition became Nusra. And so half of them split and defected and went and fought on the government side and joined some of the Palestinian brigades. And then the other half joined Nusra and ISIS, which ultimately took over Yarmouk. And that has been the fight in Yarmouk. Not some, the Syrian government's just going around massacring Palestinians because they hate Palestinians. That's the way it's being portrayed. But it's actually a conflict where an insurgency, in this case ISIS, took over Yarmouk. And I met people who fled Yarmouk, and you asked them why they fled or who they were fleeing, and they were like, everyone just started fighting. And that's pretty much what you hear from most people who flee areas of Syria. It's not so clear cut. The government just started bombing us. It's like insurgents entered our areas and fighting started.
It's like Nahr al-Bared in Lebanon in 2005 or 6, was it?
Mm-hmm. Where Salafis, entered.
Yeah, a Salafi group basically that had been sent through Syria, was dumped in Lebanon, engaged in some conflict and nested up in the Palestinian camp of Nahr al-Bared, which was eventually burned down by the Lebanese army. When I was in Beirut, I spoke to a PFLP leader I think it was in Shatila or Borj el-Brajne, another Palestinian camp, and he told me how he witnessed the offensive and how the Lebanese army, it's comprised of all these different sects, and so one person would be burning down some of the the Palestinian homes, and then another one would rush in and try to save them and try to prevent the destruction because they had different tendencies towards Palestinians based on whether they were, for example, Maronite or Sunni Muslim. And so the army itself was, behaving in a schizophrenic way. But the point is that the offensive wasn't ostensibly directed against Palestinians, but Palestinians wound up being the biggest victim of all of the different regional conspiracies and the geopolitical games that were taking place around them. And Palestinians, essentially, in this, particularly the refugees, they just generally don't want to get involved in the politics of their host country because their ultimate goal is to return home.
Yeah, and on this point on Yarmouk, this is also interesting because earlier we were talking about what shifted our views, and one of the things that shifted my views was specifically about Yarmouk, because this is one of the most insidious talking points used by some of these young supporters of the Syrian opposition. They'll be like, oh, well, Assad is killing Palestinians in Yarmouk. And when I didn't really know much about the war in Syria, that was a convincing argument. And one of the people who actually helped me see how ridiculous that position was Asad Abu Khalil. And Asad Abu Khalil, he gets criticized from both sides, but he's been an incredibly principled observer, really, on many issues for decades, but specifically since the 2011 protests, he's been extremely critical of a lot of this whole Arab Spring branding. But he's also not an Assadist. He's not an apologist for dictators. He's actually been very principled on all of these issues. And on his website, the Angry Arab News Service, Asad Abu Khalil criticized me. This was in January 2015 because I had written an article in Mondoweiss about Yarmouk, because I was talking to a lot of these people who were raising awareness of Yarmouk and the siege in Yarmouk.
In Brooklyn, New York.
And of course, what happened in Yarmouk is a complete tragedy. But Asad Abu Khalil, when I spoke with him, and he pointed out, his criticism was entirely valid, that in my article, I did not once acknowledge who the rebels were that controlled Yarmouk and what they were doing. They were, of course, hoarding food. They were shooting aid convoys. They were attacking civilians and torturing civilians. Of course, I didn't mention any of that. I just said, oh, this is a one-sided evil siege.
They were also, Ben, they were ISIS.
Yeah. Well, and then in April, 3 months after my article was published, ISIS took over Yarmouk. And then I was like, well, I got that wrong, that's for sure. Because I didn't, at that point, it's still way too late, 2015. It should have been absolutely clear. But by 2015, this is the point where you have ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, Syrian al-Qaeda, just steamroll over all the remaining rebel groups and just take over everything. And since 2015, for 3 years now, ISIS has been in control of Yarmouk. And the people who were talking about, Assad killing the Palestinians in Yarmouk have either been silent or have ignored the fact that they were talking about ISIS.
Ben, just kind of on that note.
Yeah, good call. We're approaching an hour here, so we're going to have to end part 2 of our discussion with Rania Khalek. But please join us for part 3, which will be the final hour-long segment in this lengthy discussion with Rania Khalek and Max Blumenthal. In the third part, we'll talk in much more detail about some of the propaganda on Syria, the pro-opposition propaganda, specifically coming from so-called leftist groups, most of which are Trotskyite groups. Specifically, we'll talk about the International Socialist Organization and get into more detail as to what the actual networks are pushing out a lot of this disinformation that is ultimately pro-war and pro-empire. On that note, thanks for listening to Moderate Rebels. Please join us soon for part 3.